Welcome back. Let's jump into Object.create. Alright, so this video is about Object.create. If you haven't watched the other videos in this series, then this video might not make that much sense. So I'll leave a link to the previous videos up there for you to go check out. But if you're feeling pumped and ready, then let's jump into it. So what exactly is Object.create? Well, in order to answer that, let's go check out the MDN docs. Alright, so here you can see that create is just a method, and that method creates a new object using an existing object as the prototype of the newly created object. Yeah, I didn't understand that the first time that I read it. And if you're in the same boat, let's jump into a visual explanation. Alright, so let's start off with a really basic example. We'll create a new empty object called person. You can do that by saying const person is equal to an empty object. And then we just give person a speak method by saying person.speak is equal to a new function that console logs this.phrase. Alright, so that's all pretty standard stuff. Now we'll use Object.create. So we can say const Elliot is equal to Object.create person. So what's actually happening here? Well, Object.create, surprisingly, creates an object. And that's this object over here. So where does this person argument come into play? Well, the other thing that Object.create does is it sets the prototype of the object that it just created, here, Elliot, to whatever this argument here is, which is person. So in this case, Elliot's prototype has been set to person. Well, that's all that Object.create is really doing here, and once we understand it this way, the MDN explanation starts making a little bit more sense. So let's have a look back at that and see how that applies to what we've just learned here. So the MDN docs said that the create method, firstly, creates a new object. That's Elliot over here. And it uses an existing object as the prototype of the newly created object. So the existing object here is person, which gets passed in as an argument, and that is set as the prototype of the newly created object Elliot. So although that this definition sounded really complicated initially, hopefully now that we have a visual understanding of what's happening, this all starts making a bit more sense. Alright, so this is all well and good, but what can we now actually do? Well, let's go add a phrase to Elliot. So we'll say Elliot.phrase is equal to hello friend. And now we can go Elliot.speak. And as we learned from the previous video, what JavaScript will do is it'll go check the Elliot object for a method speak. When it can't find one, it'll go to the prototype, and there on the person object, it'll find a method speak. So that's the method that it'll call. And because the speak method was just a function that console logged this.phrase, Elliot.speak will return hello friend. Now, if the this keyword confuses you, may I suggest that you go check out that video? Alright, so now that we've looked at this visually, let's walk through this in code. So we'll just start off with our basic person object. And the person object had a method called speak. And that console logs this phrase. Right? So now let's create Elliot using Object.create. So we'll do const Elliot is equal to Object.create, and we'll pass in person. The next thing that we do is we set a phrase for Elliot. So we say Elliot.phrase is equal to hello friend. And then finally we can say Elliot.speak. And now let's run all of this, and we get hello friend as the output. So now we've replicated the visual example in code. So let's go check out a few things. The first thing that we can check is whether or not Elliot's prototype is actually person. So we can go console log Elliot proto and check whether or not that's equal to person. So let's run that. and that returns true. So there's a more elegant way to check this. So what we do is person.isPrototype of, and then we can pass in Elliot. So if we run this, we also get true. So what this method is doing is it checks whether or not person is a prototype of Elliot. So you can see how that reads much nicer than the previous example. Now the other nice thing is, because we're inheriting the methods from our prototype person, we can add methods to person even after we've created Elliot. So let's have a look at that. So let's add a yell method to person. So we'll do person.yell, that's equal to a function. And here we'll console log this phrase dot to uppercase, and we might add an exclamation mark to the end. So we'll save that. And so now if we go change speak to yell and we run this, it'll say hello friend. But as you can see, person.yell was defined after we created Elliot. Alright, so now that we're hopefully comfortable with how Object.create works in code, let's have a look at our example from our previous video and how we can use Object.create for prototypal inheritance. Alright, so this is a prototypal inheritance example from the last video where we explained how the Jedi constructor function can inherit from the character constructor function. So as a quick refresher, we have this character constructor function that takes a name and a force user, and the force user is either true or false, and it then sets those properties. We also have a Jedi constructor function that takes a name and a lightsaber color. This line here calls a character constructor function and makes sure that we set these properties for any new Jedi instance. And on this line, we're just setting the lightsaber color. These two lines set up our prototype chain. We need to set Jedi's prototype to a new instance of character. And because that operation overwrites the constructor property on the Jedi's prototype object, we then need to set that on the next line like this. And finally, we're just logging out what Jedi's prototype is. And so when we run this, we get Jedi, and we have a constructor property set, which is Jedi. But the thing that was undesirable is that we have these two unnecessary properties being set that have undefined values on Jedi's prototype object. And so in the last video, I alluded to how we can use Object.create to avoid setting these properties on the Jedi's prototype object. So let's look at that a little bit more in depth now. So instead of saying Jedi.prototype is equal to new character, we can simply say Object.create and pass in the character's prototype. And so when we run this, we don't have those unnecessary properties anymore. So I know that I went through that pretty fast, so let's go look at the visual example to better understand exactly what's happening. So we start off with two separate constructor functions, a Jedi constructor function and a character constructor function. And our goal here is to make Jedi inherit from character. So originally we were achieving this by setting the Jedi's prototype to a new character instance, just like this. And as you might remember, the reason why this works is because automatically the prototype of an instance object will always reference the prototype object that belongs to the constructor function that constructed the instance object. So as we touched on previously, the Jedi prototype is now missing a constructor property because instance objects don't have constructor properties. So this means that we need to set that, and we can easily do that by saying Jedi.prototype.constructor is equal to Jedi. And so now we've achieved our goal where Jedi is inheriting from character through a prototype chain. So now we can have a look at how we achieve the same goal using Object.create. We start off with the same example where we have the two separate constructor functions, and we want Jedi to inherit from character. And this is where it's slightly different. We're still overriding the Jedi's prototype, but instead now we're setting it to Object.create of character.prototype. So what exactly is happening here? Well, Object.create is creating a new empty object, and it's automatically setting its prototype to whatever object that we pass into the method. And in this case, we're passing in character.prototype, which is referencing this object. And so what you'll notice is that this line of code lets us link Jedi's prototype object to character's prototype object. So the additional benefit here is that unlike in the last example where we were setting Jedi's prototype to a new instance of character, we're never actually calling the character constructor function. And that means that we're not setting any of the unnecessary properties that are defined in the character constructor function on Jedi's prototype, which leaves the Jedi constructor function with a pristine prototype object that has a link to character's prototype object. So just like in the example where we're using the new keyword, we're still overriding Jedi's prototype. And that means that Jedi's prototype is missing a constructor property. So again, that's very easily fixed by saying Jedi.prototype.constructor is equal to Jedi. So as you can see, just like in the example with the new keyword, our Jedi constructor function is inheriting from the character constructor function, but Jedi's prototype object is now no longer being polluted with unnecessary properties. So I hope that this clarifies what Object.create is, what it does, and how we can potentially use it in our code. Now before we wrap up, I'd like to quickly go back to the MDN docs because there's some additional functionality to Object.create that we haven't really touched on. So as we can see from the docs, Object.create can actually take two arguments. The first argument, as we've seen, is the prototype that we want to set on the newly created object. And then we have this second optional argument called properties object. Now there's actually quite a lot to cover for the secondary optional argument, and it's also closely related to object.defineProperties. And so for that reason, that's going to be the topic for the next video in this video series. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that this has been helpful, and if you have any further questions, please leave them in the comments below. But for now, I'll catch you later.